across a frozen wilderness, surrounded by enemies, led by tribes who were never meant to rise above obscurity. One nation would defy geography, history, and destiny itself. This is the impossible story of how a scattered people on the edge of civilization built the largest empire the world has ever seen. An empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Middle East, from Europe deep into Asia. This is the story of the Russian Empire, and it begins long before Russia was even Russia. Before the empire, the land of nothingness. Long before the Tsars, long before palaces and armies, the land that would one day become Russia was a vast, icy, unforgiving world. Endless forests, endless rivers, and endless danger. No Rome, no China, no Persia ever dreamed of building a civilization here, because this land broke civilizations. Winter was not a season, it was a weapon. Here, survival wasn't guaranteed. And yet, from this brutal landscape, scattered Slavic tribes began carving out small wooden settlements. They had no kings, no unified laws, no organized state. They were farmers, hunters, and traders, struggling against nature itself. Then everything changed when outsiders arrived. 2. The Viking thunder, the birth of Rus. In the 9th century, the rivers of Eastern Europe carried a new kind of visitor, Norse warriors, known as the Varangians. To the Slavs, they were both a threat and an opportunity. These Vikings understood something crucial. Rivers were highways. Whoever controlled the rivers controlled the land. According to the ancient chronicle, the Slavs invited one Viking ruler, Rurik, to bring order. Whether legend or truth, one thing is certain. The arrival of the Varangians unified the chaos. Thus, the first proto-Russian state was born, Kievan Rus. It wasn't Russian yet, it wasn't an empire, but it was the spark. Rurik's successors expanded along the river routes, trading furs, wax, honey, and slaves with the Byzantine Empire. In return, they learned diplomacy, architecture, administration, and eventually something far more powerful. 3rd, the conversion. How a religion built a nation. In 988, Prince Vladimir the Great made a decision that would change world history. He converted to Orthodox Christianity, aligning his people with Byzantine culture rather than Rome or the Islamic world. This wasn't just a religious choice. It was a geopolitical weapon. Christianity brought literacy, architecture, laws, identity, everything Kievan Rus lacked. Churches rose from the forest floor like monuments to a new world. A civilization was forming, fast, and yet destiny had a darker plan. 4. The Great Collapse. Fire from the east. No empire was ready for the storm that arrived in the 13th century. The Mongols, they didn't knock. They didn't negotiate. They erased. In 1240, the Mongol Empire swept through Kievan Rus with fire and terror. Cities burned, families vanished. The old order shattered. For 2 centuries, the Ruses' principalities were forced to pay tribute to the Golden Horde. To the outside world, the future Russian Empire was dead before it began. But under Mongol rule, something unexpected happened. The Rus learned the Mongols' secrets, administration, taxation, military discipline, and waited patiently for the moment to rise again. And that moment would come from an unexpected place, a tiny, unimportant town on the edge of the wild, Moscow. Moscow rises, the wolf in the shadows. In the 1300s, Moscow was small, weak, and surrounded by stronger rivals. But it had 2 advantages. 1, clever rulers. 2, a strategic location where trade routes crossed Moscow's princes mastered one skill better than everyone else: survival. They cooperated with the Mongols until they didn't. Through cunning diplomacy, bribery, calculated alliances, and ruthless ambition, Moscow absorbed rival principalities one by one. Within a century, the once insignificant town became the beating heart of a new political force. And then came the figure who turned survival into domination, Ivan III, Ivan the Great. 6. Ivan the Great. the end of Mongol chains. By the late 1400s, Ivan III declared what no Rus prince had dared say in 250 years: "We owe the Mongols nothing." At the Ugra River in 1480, the Mongol standoff ended without a battle, because the Mongols simply turned back. Their power was fading, Russia's was rising. Ivan III tripled Moscow's territory, built the Kremlin, centralized power, and declared Moscow the Third Rome, the new center of Christian civilization after the fall of Constantinople. A new idea was born. Russia was destined for greatness. But destiny is a dangerous thing, especially when a new ruler takes it too seriously. 7. The Storm of Ivan the Terrible. When Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, took power in 1547, he had one vision: an empire that would dominate the world. And unlike previous rulers, Ivan wasn't content with defending territory. He wanted to expand, violently. Under Ivan, Russia pushed past the Ural Mountains, conquering the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. The empire now stretched into Siberia, an unimaginable frontier of forests, mountains, ice, and unimaginable riches. But Ivan's mind was a battlefield too. Paranoia consumed him. He created the Oprichnina, a brutal secret police force that terrorized his own people. Entire cities were destroyed. Trust collapsed. The dream of stability shattered. By the time Ivan died in 1584, Russia was enormous but unstable, and instability invited chaos. 8. The Time of Troubles. The near death of a future empire. Between 1598 and 1613, Russia plunged into what historians now call the Time of Troubles, one of the darkest eras in its existence. There was no clear heir. Factions tore the country apart. Famine killed millions. Foreign armies invaded. False tsars claimed the throne. For a moment, it seemed the Russian Empire would die before it was even born. But then, from the desperation of the people, a new dynasty emerged, the Romanovs. And with them came the most ambitious transformation Russia had ever seen. And that is where part 2 will begin. Russia should have vanished, invaded, starving, leaderless, burning from within. Most nations would have died in the time of troubles. But instead, something unimaginable happened. From the ashes of a collapsing nation, a new dynasty would rise, bringing order to chaos, stability to ruin, and ambition to a land that had nearly forgotten hope. This was not just survival. This was the beginning of the Romanov Empire. The boy who saved a broken nation. In 1613, Russia faced its greatest question: who will rule? Who can possibly unite this fractured land? The answer came from a monastery. A 16-year-old boy, Mikhail Romanov, was chosen as the new Tsar. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a conqueror. He wasn't even seeking the throne. But he had one thing Russia desperately needed: a name that symbolized peace, not war. The Romanovs were connected to Ivan the Terrible's first wife, linking them to legitimacy without the terror of Ivan's later years. The people believed a child ruler could be shaped into a symbol of unity. And so a teenager became Tsar of a shattered country. His first challenge: restore order or watch Russia die. 2. Stability returns. Slowly, painfully. The early Romanovs rebuilt Russia, one difficult step at a time. They restored agriculture after the famines. They negotiated peace with Sweden and Poland. They reorganized the military. They began rebuilding Moscow, which had been burned to the ground. Mikhail's father, Patriarch Filaret, effectively co-ruled and provided the political experience his son lacked. For the first time in decades, the chaos quieted. But Russia was still fragile, poor, isolated, technologically behind Europe, and trapped between powerful neighbors. It wasn't enough to survive. Russia needed to transform. And the person who would drag Russia into a new era was still a child, living in a fortress, dreaming of ships. His name was Peter. Enter Peter, the Tsar who refused to be normal. Peter Romanov was unlike any ruler Russia had ever seen. Tall, restless, obsessed with machines, ships, and the outer world. He hated court politics and spent his youth wandering Moscow's foreign districts, learning from Dutch, English, and German craftsmen. Instead of dressing like a tsar, he dressed like a sailor. Instead of ordering people around, he learned from them. Russia didn't know it yet, but Peter would become one of the most transformational leaders in human history. He came to power in 1682, but it wouldn't be until he ruled alone, after years of internal struggle, that he began reshaping Russia from the ground up. And the transformation started with the one thing Russia lacked most, a navy. 4. The Great Northern War Russia faces, a superpower. Peter believed Russia could never become an empire without access to the sea. But the Baltic coast was controlled by a mighty foe, Sweden. Under King Charles V, Sweden was a military powerhouse, young, ruthless, undefeated. When Peter declared war, many European leaders predicted Russia's immediate destruction. What followed was a 21-year nightmare of winter marches, sieges, and brutal battles. Peter's early defeats were humiliating, but he did something few rulers dared. He used those defeats to rebuild. He reorganized the army. He introduced Western drilling techniques. He built an entire navy from scratch. He invited engineers, scientists, architects, and generals from across Europe. By 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, everything changed. The once backward Russians crushed Sweden's legendary army. Suddenly, Europe saw Russia not as a frozen wilderness, but as a rising superpower. With the new capital, born from swampland after victory, Peter made a decision that shocked the world. He moved the capital from ancient Moscow to a swamp on the Baltic coast. Out of mud, disease, and endless labor, he built a new city, St. Petersburg. It was the window to Europe, elegant, geometric, designed with foreign architecture, unlike anything Russia had ever known. The message was clear. Russia would no longer imitate Europe. Russia would compete with Europe. The empire now had a new face, open, ambitious, hungry for influence. But the transformation had a dark cost. Tens of thousands of laborers died building the city. Peter's reforms crushed traditional power structures. Resistance brewed in the shadows. Peter didn't care. He believed Russia could only rise through pain and discipline. And when he died in 1725, he left behind a nation utterly changed. But the Romanov dynasty's greatest ruler was still to come. 6. The Age of Imperial Brilliance. The Rise of Catherine. A German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst arrived in Russia at 14, married into the Romanov family, learned the language, embraced orthodoxy, and renamed herself Catherine. Through political maneuvering, some say conspiracy, she became Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, in 1762. Under her rule, Russia expanded dramatically, crushing Ottoman armies, securing access to the Black Sea, colonizing new lands. Absorbing much of Poland during its partitions, Catherine turned Russia into one of the great intellectual centers of Europe. She corresponded with Voltaire, modernized administration, funded art, and expanded education. But not all was enlightenment. Serfdom deepened, social inequality hardened, revolts grew. Still, the empire had reached a new height, a European superpower, a continental giant. What Peter began, Catherine completed. Russia had become an empire in every sense, military, cultural, territorial. But expansion creates friction, and friction creates war. 7. The shockwaves of Napoleon, Russia against the Emperor of Europe. In the early 1800s, Europe trembled under a new force, Napoleon Bonaparte. Nations fell like dominoes, but Russia refused. After years of tension, conflict erupted into the French invasion of 1812, one of the most dramatic military campaigns in history. Napoleon marched into Russia with the largest army Europe had ever seen. Russia retreated, burned its own cities, and pulled Napoleon deeper and deeper into the cold. Then came the moment that shattered Napoleon's dream of world conquest, the Russian winter. Starvation, frostbite, disease, ambushes, a collapsing supply system. Napoleon entered Moscow in triumph and found it burning. A ghost city. The retreat that followed became a massacre. Only a tiny fraction of his army survived. This defeat didn't just save Russia, it reshaped the world. For the first time, Russia became the arbiter of European politics. But behind this imperial glory, new pressures were building. Pressure that would eventually crack the empire in ways no tsar could foresee. 8. The empire's hidden weakness. By the mid-1800s, the Russian Empire seemed unstoppable. It stretched across continents, controlled vast resources, and commanded millions of soldiers. But beneath the surface lay fatal weaknesses. A massive population trapped in serfdom, slow industrial development, outdated military structures, a vast geography impossible to govern efficiently. Russia was huge, but fragile. And soon the world would learn that even giants can bleed. The Russian Empire looked invincible, unstoppable armies, endless land, a throne that had stood for centuries. But the stronger an empire appears on the outside, the more dangerous the cracks hidden within. And in the 19th century, those cracks began to split wide open. Through war, through rebellion, through reforms that came too late and too slowly. This is the story of how the Romanovs tried to save the empire, and how, without knowing it, they planted the seeds of its destruction. Then just the Crimean disaster. The myth of Russian power shattered. In 1853, Russia believed it could dominate the Ottoman Empire and expand into the Black Sea and Mediterranean. What Russia didn't expect was the West. Britain and France stepped in to stop Russian expansion, unleashing what became known as the Crimean War. At first, Russians assumed victory, but modern warfare exposed the empire's weaknesses brutally. Outdated rifles, slow communication, poor medical care, inefficient supply chains, obsolete naval technology. Sevastopol turned into a year-long slaughter. Russian soldiers fought bravely, but bravery couldn't defeat modern industrial firepower. In 1856, Russia conceded defeat. It was humiliating. The empire's reputation collapsed overnight. For the first time in centuries, the Romanovs realized a terrifying truth. Russia was falling behind. And if nothing changed, the empire would not survive the next century. The two, Alexander II, the Tsar who tried to save everything. When Alexander II took the throne in 1855, he inherited a nation that was massive, but outdated. The Crimean defeat forced him to make a decision no Tsar had ever dared: modernize Russia or watch it collapse. His most radical act came in 1861. He freed 23 million serfs. It was the largest emancipation of humans in recorded history. But freedom came with flaws. Serfs received land, but had to pay huge redemption payments. Villages struggled with poverty. Landowners lost labor. The countryside destabilized. Still, Alexander II pushed forward, reformed the courts, modernized the military, expanded railways, encouraged industrial growth, allowed local self-government through the Zemstvo system. For a moment, Russia felt hopeful, a nation finally catching up with the world. But change creates backlash. Conservatives accused Alexander of destroying tradition. Revolutionaries called him too slow. Extremists plotted. The Tsar who freed millions soon found himself hunted. Third, the rise of revolutionary movements. By the late 1800s, Russia was boiling. Three powerful currents collided. One, the liberals educated elites, demanding constitutional government, civil rights, and political reforms. The socialists, believing Russia needed a complete transformation, workers' rights, equality, and the end of the autocracy. Three, the radicals, a dangerous group who believed only violence could change Russia. Underground printing presses spread ideas. Secret societies organized attacks. Universities became breeding grounds for revolutionaries. The empire responded with censorship, arrests, and executions. But the more the Romanovs cracked down, the stronger the resistance grew. The tension reached a deadly climax in 1881. If the assassination of a Tsar, March 1st, 1881. In Petersburg, Alexander II was returning to the Winter Palace when a bomb exploded near his carriage. He stepped out, shaken but alive, and that was his mistake. A second bomber approached and threw another explosive at his feet. The blast tore through the Tsar's body. The man who had freed millions died in the snow, killed by the very radicals who claimed he wasn't progressing fast enough. His death shook the empire. It marked the moment reforms slowed, fear increased, and the Romanovs turned inward. V's Alexander III, the Iron Tsar. Alexander III, son of the murdered Tsar, responded to the assassination by reversing many reforms. He believed the empire needed strong autocracy, strict censorship, a loyal, centralized police force, Russification policies, control over education. He rebuilt the military, expanded the Trans-Siberian Railway, and restored stability through force. Under him, Russia industrialized rapidly. Cities exploded with workers, factories filled the skyline, railroads stretched thousands of miles. But harsh order came with consequences. Minority groups faced discrimination. Radicals went underground. Industrial workers suffered brutal conditions. The pressure in the empire was rising. And when Alexander III suddenly died in 1894, the throne passed to a man unprepared for the storm to come. 6. Nicholas II, the last Tsar. Nicholas II did not want to be Tsar. He admitted openly, "I am not ready. I have no idea how to rule." But history doesn't wait for readiness. Nicholas inherited a rapidly changing empire, massive population growth, fast industrialization, rising worker movements, growing socialist ideologies, mounting ethnic tensions. He needed to be flexible, modern, and politically sharp. But Nicholas II believed in absolute monarchy. He trusted tradition when his nation needed transformation. And his first major test came from an unlikely enemy. 7. The Russo-Japanese War, a global humiliation. In 1904, Russia went to war with Japan over control of ports and influence in East Asia. Russia expected an easy victory. Japan was seen as a small, inferior nation. What followed shocked the world. Japan's modern navy and disciplined military devastated Russian forces. The Russian Pacific Fleet was destroyed. The Baltic Fleet sailed halfway around the world, only to be obliterated at the Battle of Tsushima. Russian armies were defeated on land. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian nation had defeated a European empire. The defeat shattered Russia's prestige. Soldiers mutinied, workers went on strike. Cities erupted in protests. The empire was cracking. Afrin, the 1905 revolution, the first earthquake, January 22, 1905, known as Bloody Sunday. Peaceful protesters marched to the Winter Palace, asking for better wages, shorter workdays, and political rights. They carried icons, sang hymns, and expected the Tsar to listen. Instead, imperial soldiers opened fire. The massacre changed everything. Millions of Russians turned against the monarchy. Strikes paralyzed the empire. Peasants rebelled. Sailors mutinied, most famously on the battleship Potemkin. Nicholas II was forced to issue the October Manifesto, creating an elected parliament, the Duma, basic civil liberties, limited political participation. But he later undermined the Duma's power, restoring autocracy in all but name. The revolution quieted, but the anger remained. Like a dormant volcano, the empire waited for the next eruption. And it would come soon, born from the largest war the world had ever seen. 9. The imperial system on the edge. On the surface, Russia still looked like a great empire, huge population, growing industries, enormous territories, powerful military. But beneath that surface, workers lived in poverty. Peasants struggled under debt. Minorities faced oppression. Revolutionaries grew in number. The royal family seemed out of touch. One final shock was all it needed to collapse. And that shock was coming from Europe, where alliances were forming, tensions rising, and nations preparing for a conflict far beyond anything humanity had ever witnessed. A war that would destroy kings, break empires, and rewrite the world. A war called World War I. It wasn't famine, it wasn't revolution. It wasn't even the Tsar's mistakes. The event that finally shattered the Russian Empire was a war it should never have entered. A war that consumed millions, exposed every weakness, and pushed an already shaking empire into total collapse. This is how World War I broke the Romanovs. Not slowly, but violently, brutally, and beyond repair. The call to arms. A nation sprints toward disaster. When World War I began in 1914, Russia entered the conflict full of pride. Crowds filled the streets, flags waved. The empire believed it was fighting for honor, Slavic unity, and the protection of Serbia. But behind the patriotic celebrations lay a terrible reality. Russia was not prepared. Ammunition shortages, poor training, outdated equipment, weak rail systems, corrupt supply chains, slow communication. Still, Russia mobilized one of the largest armies on earth. Millions of soldiers marched to the front with confidence and almost no idea what modern war really meant. 2. The war begins, and Russia bleeds immediately. The first major clash was in East Prussia. The Battle of Tannenberg. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. German forces encircled two entire Russian armies. Nearly 200,000 Russian soldiers were killed or captured in a matter of days. The world watched in shock. Russia had the numbers, millions of troops. But Germany had something Russia lacked: modern strategy, modern weapons, modern leadership. Russia's early defeats exposed everything the empire had tried to hide. And worse was yet to come. The war-hungry machine. Russia's home front collapses. As the front lines spread across Eastern Europe, the Russian home front began falling apart. Food shortages, exploding prices, coal scarcity, overcrowded cities, factory strikes, transport breakdowns. A rail system unable to feed both soldiers and civilians. In winter, entire towns froze. Workers abandoned factories. Bread lines stretched for hours. People blamed the government. Then they blamed the Tsar. Nicholas's fatal decision. The Tsar takes command of the army. In 1915, Nicholas II made the most catastrophic mistake of his reign. He personally took command of the Russian army. It sounded noble. It was political suicide. Nicholas had no military skill. He had no strategic experience. And by leaving the capital, he left the government in the hands of a deeply unpopular figure, Empress Alexandra, a woman distrusted by the public, despised by the nobility, and blamed for every disaster that followed. But Alexandra had her own influence behind her, a mysterious, controversial figure whose presence would push Russia into chaos. Enter Rasputin, healer, mystic, and national scandal. Grigory Rasputin, a wandering Siberian monk, a healer, a mystic, and the most divisive man in Russia. The imperial family believed he had supernatural power to heal the Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Because of this, Rasputin gained immense influence over Alexandra. Rumors exploded that Rasputin controlled the government, that he made decisions for the empire, that he corrupted the royal family, that he weakened Russia's war effort. Much of it was exaggerated, but the damage was real. To the public, Rasputin symbolized everything wrong with the monarchy: blind loyalty, superstition, and corruption. Conspirators decided the empire could no longer survive with Rasputin alive. The assassination of Rasputin. The last warning, December 1916. A group of nobles invited Rasputin to a palace. Their plan: kill him, save the monarchy. What happened next became legend. They poisoned him. He survived. They shot him. He stood up. They shot him again. He still moved. Finally, they beat him, wrapped him in cloth, and threw him into the freezing Neva River. When Rasputin's body was found, his lungs contained water, meaning he died drowning. Even in death, he fueled conspiracy, fear, and chaos. But killing Rasputin didn't save the monarchy. It only revealed how desperate the empire had become. The Romanovs were out of time. In 1917, the empire breaks. In early 1917, the final collapse began. Petrograd was frozen, starving, exhausted. Women stood in line for bread until they could no longer feel their hands. Workers struck, soldiers mutinied. On February 23rd, protests erupted. By February 26th, hundreds of thousands filled the streets. By February 27th, soldiers joined the rioters. The Tsar ordered the army to restore order. The army refused. In a matter of days, the Romanov state, the empire that had ruled for more than 300 years, collapsed. The abdication, the end of the Romanovs, March 15, 1917. Nicholas II, isolated on a train, surrounded by generals who no longer trusted him, signed a document ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. He abdicated the throne, no ceremony, no fanfare, no final speech. Just a signature that ended an empire. A temporary government took power, promising democracy, peace, and reform. But Russia was not heading toward peace. It was heading toward something darker, a struggle for power that would decide the fate of millions. A new government and a new problem. The provisional government faced impossible challenges: continue the war or withdraw. Feed cities collapsing from hunger. Calm soldiers who refused to fight. Control radical movements growing in the streets. They promised elections. They promised rights. They promised freedom, but promises don't fill stomachs. The war dragged on, prices soared, and support for the government evaporated. Into the chaos stepped a man who had been in exile for years. A man whose ideas would ignite a revolution unlike any the world had seen. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin returns, and Russia turns red. April 1917. A sealed train traveled from Switzerland to Petrograd. On it, Lenin and a group of exiles. Within hours of arriving, Lenin declared, "All power to the Soviets. Peace, land, and bread, down with the provisional government." His words electrified Russia's workers and soldiers, and the Bolshevik movement, until then small, exploded in popularity. While the government debated, Lenin planned. While the government hesitated, Lenin organized. And by autumn, the provisional government barely controlled its own capital. The empire was gone. Its replacement was failing. A new power was rising, a power willing to do whatever it took. Satita, the storm is coming. Russia in late 1917 was a nation split in two. One side desperate for order, the other hungry for revolution. Factories shut down. Railways froze, soldiers deserted by the thousands. Peasants seized land, cities starved. It was a vacuum of power, and Lenin saw the moment. Soon the Bolsheviks would strike. Soon the world would witness the birth of a new state, born not from diplomacy, but from force, from fire, from revolution. At the dawn of the 18th century, the Russian Empire was already enormous. But in Part 5, it becomes something else entirely, a superstate fueled by ambition, fear, revolution, and raw, unstoppable expansion. This is the era when Russia didn't just grow, it devoured continents. The aftershock of Peter's vision, Peter the Great, dies in 1725, but the ghost of his ambition never leaves Russia. The palace in St. Petersburg becomes a battlefield of politics, intrigue, and sudden deaths. Empresses rise and fall, courtiers manipulate succession. But beneath the chaos, Russia keeps expanding. His navy remains, his modern army remains. His idea that Russia must dominate the north, the east, and the south remains. And soon a new titan emerges, Elizabeth, the empress of extravagance and war. Elizabeth Petrovna, daughter of Peter, storms the throne in a dramatic coup. She promises one thing: no one will execute a single person under her rule. But she never promises peace. Her reign becomes a whirlwind, lavish parties, golden palaces, endless celebrations, and war. A lot of war. Russia plunges into the 7 Years' War, one of the first true world wars. Against Prussia, against Britain, against the greatest armies of Europe. And shockingly, Russia wins battles that Europe never expected it could. By 1762, Russian troops march deep into Berlin. Prussia is on the brink of collapse. Europe prepares for a world where Russia dominates everything. Then in a twist worthy of a movie, Elizabeth dies. Her successor, Peter III, who worships Prussian King Frederick the Great, immediately pulls Russia out of the war. Just like that, the almost victory dissolves, but Russia's military reputation unshakable. Catherine the Great, the empire's golden giant. Peter III doesn't last long. His wife, a German princess named Catherine, stages one of the cleanest coups in history. She becomes empress. And under her rule, Russia reaches a golden age of art, philosophy, and ruthless power. Catherine modernizes the empire even further than Peter. Schools for nobles, new laws, European sciences, a capital city that rivals Paris. But cultural brilliance is only one side of her. The other, territorial conquest on a scale Europe hasn't seen since the Roman Empire. The partitions of Poland, a country, erased in the late 1700s, Poland is weak, unstable, and divided. To Russia, it's an opportunity. To Europe, it's a shock. Catherine quietly orchestrates political manipulation inside Poland, forcing a king loyal to Russia onto the throne. But soon, Prussia and Austria join the game. Three superpowers carve Poland into pieces, like a map drawn in sand. By 1795, Poland disappears from Europe entirely, wiped off the map, absorbed into Catherine's empire. This moment sends a message to the world. Russia is no longer a rising empire. It is the empire. The Black Sea Dream, destroying the Ottoman wall. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire blocked Russia from warm water ports. Without them, Russia couldn't trade year-round, couldn't be a naval superpower, couldn't dominate the Mediterranean. Catherine decides to break that wall. Russia launches war after war against the Ottomans. Battles rage across Crimea, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. Victories pile up. The Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, starts shaking. And in 1783, Catherine does the unthinkable. She annexes Crimea, securing Russia's permanent access to the Black Sea. This single action transforms Russia from a land empire into a maritime giant. The Pugachev Rebellion, when the empire almost collapses. But greatness always comes with a cost. A man named Yemelyan Pugachev, claiming to be the dead Peter III, sparks the largest rebellion in Russian history. Peasants, Cossacks, miners, millions rise up. Cities burn, fortresses fall. For a moment it seems Catherine's empire might crack in half. But the rebellion is crushed with brutal force. Tens of thousands die. Russia tightens its grip on its people. This will echo across centuries until 1917. The age of giants ends. Catherine dies in 1796. She leaves behind a country transformed. A modernized administration, a dominant army, vast new territories, a powerful navy, a European-level culture, a capital city glittering with imperial wealth, but also deep inequality, serfdom at its harshest point, rising internal tension, enemies multiplying at the borders. The Russian Empire is bigger, richer, and more powerful than ever. Yet it also carries the seeds of future explosions. And the 19th century? It will bring wars, revolutions, emperors, assassinations, and the beginning of the end. The 19th century arrives like a storm, and the Russian Empire is about to face the greatest wars, the boldest reforms, and the deadliest uprisings in its entire history. This is the century when Russia becomes a global titan, and when the forces that will one day destroy the empire first awaken. The last of the autocrats, Paul I and the shock of change. Catherine the Great dies in 1796. Her son, Paul I, takes the throne, but he is nothing like her. Where Catherine was strategic, he is impulsive. Where she expanded, he restricts. Where she charmed nobles, he terrifies them. Paul reforms the military, slaps heavy rules on noble privilege, and dreams of a disciplined empire run like a giant garrison. The nobility hates him, foreign courts distrust him. His paranoia grows, and in 1801 he is assassinated in his own palace. His son, Alexander III, becomes emperor. Paul's death sends a clear message. Even emperors are not safe in Russia. Napoleon, the man who made Russia a superpower, Europe is on fire. Napoleon dominates continent after continent. Kings fall, armies shatter. But one country stands between him and total victory, Russia. Alexander the Fire and Napoleon begin as allies, but their alliance collapses under the weight of ego and ambition. Then comes 1812, the invasion that defines history, the Inferno of Moscow. Napoleon marches 500,000 soldiers into Russia, the largest land invasion Europe has ever seen. The Russian army retreats, burning everything behind them. Cities, crops, supplies, a haunting strategy known as scorched earth. Napoleon reaches Moscow expecting surrender. Instead, the city is empty, and then it burns. With no shelter, no food, and a brutal winter descending, the French army collapses. Of the 500,000 who marched in, less than 50,000 limp back. Napoleon is finished. Russia emerges as the savior of Europe and a true global power. The Congress of Vienna. Russia rewrites Europe after defeating Napoleon. Russia becomes the dominant force in continental politics. Alexander I redraws borders, crushes revolutions, and helps build a new order. But at home, the seeds of unrest grow. The Congress of Vienna. Russia rewrites Europe. After defeating Napoleon, Russia becomes the dominant force in continental politics. Alexander I redraws borders, crushes revolutions, and helps build a new order. But at home, the seeds of unrest grow. The Deckmarist Revolt, a spark of revolution. When Alexander D dies suddenly in 1825, confusion erupts over succession. In the chaos, young Russian officers launch a revolution, the Decembrist Revolt. They demand a constitution, an end to autocracy, and rights for the people. It lasts one day. Nicholas I, the new Tsar, crushes it mercilessly. 5 leaders are hanged, hundreds exiled to Siberia. Nicholas becomes known as the Iron Tsar. Strict, authoritarian, unbending. He builds a massive secret police force. He censors everything. He smothers any spark of rebellion. But that pressure only builds steam. The Crimean War. The empire reveals its weakness by the 1850s. Russia looks powerful, but its technology is decades behind Europe. Its infrastructure is primitive. Its army is huge but outdated. And when Russia collides with Britain, France, and the Ottomans in the Crimean War, the truth becomes impossible to hide. The siege of Sevastopol, Russia's greatest port, becomes a graveyard. Artillery rains, hospitals collapse, tens of thousands die. For the first time in centuries, Russia loses a major war. The world sees a titan, bleeding, cracking, exposed. Nicholas I dies during the war, leaving his son to pick up the pieces. Alexander II, the Tsar who tried to save the empire. Alexander II realizes something dangerous. If Russia does not change, it will collapse. He launches the greatest reforms since Peter the Great: emancipation of the serfs, new courts, local self-government, modern railways, military modernization, economic opening. For the first time in history, millions of peasants gain freedom. Russia begins to industrialize, cities grow. Ideas spread, but freedom unleashes energy the empire cannot control. The rise of revolutionary movements. Workers demand rights. Peasants demand land. Students demand democracy. Radicals demand the end of the monarchy. Bombings, assassinations, riots, underground groups. The empire becomes a powder keg. And in 1881, Alexander II is assassinated by a bomb in St. Petersburg. His reforms die with him. The return to repression. Alexander III and Nicholas II. Alexander III reverses reforms, crushes dissent, and rebuilds autocracy. He imposes Russification, secret police, strict censorship, heavy industrial expansion. By the time Nicholas II becomes emperor in 1894, Russia is a modernizing giant wrapped in authoritarian chains. But beneath the surface, anger grows. The empire enters the 20th century, a titan. With cracks, industry rises. Railroads stretch across Siberia. Cities swell with workers. But poverty deepens, strikes intensify. Political groups multiply. The empire is bigger than ever, but more unstable than ever. And soon, a war with Japan, a revolution, and eventually World War I will push Russia over the edge. This is it, the final chapter. The last breath of a 300-year-old empire. The moment when a kingdom that once ruled 1/6 of the planet collapses in fire, war, and revolution, and vanishes forever. The last Tsar, Nicholas II, and the shadow of doom. Nicholas II ascends the throne in 1894, a gentle, family-loving man, but completely unprepared to rule a superpower. He clings to absolute autocracy. He ignores warnings from ministers. He trusts mystics, court whispers, and his own fatal optimism. Meanwhile, Russia changes faster than the palace can understand. Cities explode with population. Factories roar. Workers organize. Students riot. Radical ideas spread like wildfire. The empire is becoming modern, but the monarchy stays medieval. The Russo-Japanese War. A shock that shatters confidence. In 1904, Russia picks a fight with Japan, assuming victory is inevitable. But Japan is industrialized, disciplined, and ready. The result is humiliation. The Pacific Fleet destroyed. Port Arthur lost. The Baltic Fleet annihilated at Tsushima. Thousands dead. National pride shattered. For the first time, a European empire loses to an Asian power. The shock destroys public confidence in the monarchy. 1905, when revolution first roared, January 1905. Workers march peacefully to the Winter Palace, asking the Tsar for reforms. But soldiers panic and open fire. Hundreds die. A moment remembered as Bloody Sunday. The empire explodes, strikes, uprisings, peasant revolts. Mutinies in the navy, an entire empire boiling. Nicholas is forced to create the Duma, a parliament, but he weakens it, manipulates it, and keeps absolute power. The message to the people is clear. Nothing will change unless the entire system is destroyed. The dark influence of Rasputin. As the empire crumbles, a mysterious Siberian monk rises to power, Grigory Rasputin. He gains influence by supposedly healing the Tsar's sick son, Alexei. Soon he becomes feared, hated, and mythologized. A holy man? A fraud? A puppet master? A symptom of a dying monarchy? Nobles despise him, ministers fear him. Foreign ambassadors record his scandals. Rasputin becomes the symbol of corruption at the heart of the imperial court, and his murder in 1916 only proves how desperate the elite have become. World War I, the final straw, 1914. Europe descends into the deadliest war humanity has ever seen. Russia enters the conflict with pride, and within months it begins to bleed. The Russian army suffers disaster after disaster. Shortages of rifles. No boots, no medical supplies, bad leadership, massive casualties, millions die. Millions more are wounded or captured. The economy collapses. Food disappears from cities, railways crumble, people freeze in their homes. And Nicholas makes the worst decision of his life. He takes direct command of the army. Now every defeat is his personal failure. The February Revolution, the empire finally breaks, 1917. Bread disappears from Petrograd, women protest, workers strike, soldiers refuse to fire on them. Days later, the army mutinies. Factories seize control. Crowds fill the streets. The empire collapses from the inside in less than a week. Nicholas tries to return to his capital, but his train is stopped. Generals, politicians, even his own supporters tell him the truth. His reign is over. On March 15, 1917, he abdicates. The Romanov dynasty, over 300 years old, ends in a single signature. The Russian Empire is gone. The battle for Russia's soul. Bolsheviks versus the provisional government. A provisional government replaces the monarchy, but it refuses to leave World War I. It fails to solve hunger. It fails to give land to peasants. It fails to control the streets. Meanwhile, a different force rises. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, promising peace, land, bread, power to the workers. Support grows. Soldiers defect. Factories switch sides. Soviets take control of cities. By October, the provisional government is hopelessly weak. The October Revolution, when the old world died, October 25th, 1917. Under the cover of night, Bolshevik forces surround Petrograd. They seize bridges, storm telegraph offices, take over train stations, and finally, they enter the Winter Palace. In hours, without dramatic battles or long sieges, the government collapses. Russia becomes the world's first communist state. The imperial world ends. A new world begins. The Civil War, the final funeral of the empire. But the revolution does not bring peace. Instead, it unleashes a war of unimaginable brutality. Reds versus whites, Bolsheviks versus monarchists, workers versus nobles, villages versus cities, Russian versus Russian. Entire towns burn, famine kills millions, foreign armies invade, epidemics sweep the land, neighbors become enemies. By 1922, the Bolsheviks win. The old empire lies in ruins. The Romanovs are dead, millions have perished. And from the ashes, a new state emerges. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. The Russian Empire, once the largest kingdom on earth, is officially gone. The final word, the legacy of a fallen giant. For over 3 centuries, the Russian Empire shaped continents. It conquered Siberia. It defeated Napoleon. It rewrote Europe. It built cities of gold and armies of steel. But it also carried wounds it could never heal. Inequality, autocracy, repression, corruption, endless wars. The moment modernity arrived, those wounds burst open, and the empire collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Russian Empire died not in one moment, but through a century of pressure, war, and rising voices demanding change. Empires rise, empires fall. But the story of the Russian Empire is a reminder of a truth older than any throne. Power lasts only as long as the people allow it. And once their patience ends, even the mightiest empire can disappear in a single revolution. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more epic history documentaries. This is the story of time, and this was the complete rise and fall of the Russian Empire.